talking about what the fuck is happening, 5 consumer trends for 2020. I'm Holly.
And I'm Lucia.
And we both work for an agency called Fjord in London. And my background is UX. I've got an experience strategy sort of interest as well, and I tend to work with emerging technologies. I'm super interested in AI, and I like trends.
And my name is Lucia. I work as a business designer at Fjord, and my background is in creative strategy, foresight, and branding. And this is actually how Holly and I met in Fjord, which is a global design innovation agency, and we work there together on a number of trend-related projects. And when we work at Trends, we use something that we call future thinking. And it's a process that some of you might be familiar with. It's similar to design thinking in a way how it uses some kind of same processes and ways of thinking, but actually rather than arriving to one final idea, it helps us to open up and understand what could be possible. So rather than showing us one version of what the future will be, it shows us multiple different worlds that future could go based on what's happening today. And one of the main skills that we use in future thinking is pattern spotting. So we spend a lot of our time observing the world for signals and behavioral signs and kind of drivers, and trying to understand how they connect together and what kind of behavioral shifts and pattern could these suggest.
The reason that we've moved over to future thinking from design thinking is really about the pace of change that's happening at the moment. So we know with new technology that's coming along, change is faster than it ever has been before. And the changes that we find tend to be a result of environmental impact, of social, of economic and political changes that are happening. And actually, quite often there's a large meta-trend that pulls them all together, and that tends to be looking at a more generational shift.
And if we look at what happened in the past 10 years, one of these meta-trends that affected a lot was millennial angst over the old rules of life that were defined by the previous generation. So whether this was workplace culture, the way we're consuming, inequality, and quite a lot of the physical trash that was left. And often when we hear about millennials, there are words describing them such as entitled, narcissism, and anger, and so on. But actually these adjectives are not very unique to millennials. It's just character traits unique to young people. What made it different for millennials was that they were brought up and grew up with access and technology that actually gave them power, tools, and voice to do something about this. And whilst it helped them to do a lot and change a lot, what happened as a downside of this was that now what Generation Z is getting angry about is quite a lot of the mental and digital trash that millennials left with their actions. So we felt this was quite a big shift that sits on top of majority of the trends that we'll be talking about today. Which brings us to our first trend that we call off-screen is what the doctor ordered. And on the surface, this doesn't sound that new because we've all been talking about unsubscribing and kind of turning down a notification for a while. But actually what made it different this year that it stopped being just a lifestyle fad. Actually, it has become a health concern. And we can see with things like the rising levels of anxiety in the country, actually with people quitting social media, especially younger generations, as well as realizing and being much more open, talking about mental health issues. This year was the year where UK government published guidelines for parents of how much should their children spend on social media and technology, and actually now we have GPs prescribing time in the nature as a remedy. So as we see this digital minimalism, we treat it very much in the same way as we do the physical clutter, but unlike physical clutter, you can't just get rid of digital clutter because it multiplies every day with every new post, with every new email that you get. Also, this was the year that the good tech kind of went bad, and we could see the people who work in the big tech and Facebook and Google standing up and speaking up about the practices that are happening inside these companies, often behind the products and services they design and why they made us addicted. And loads of these people are now leaving and setting up new companies and movements that are trying to bring the good back into technology. We also see this thirst for in real life experiences. And one way where we see this is the new types of technology that help us enable us to have better offline experiences. So this could be things like voice interfaces or the Apple screen time. They help us actually to be more aware and manage our screen times. And also if you think about the most successful tech companies now in many ways are those that help us to have better offline experiences such as Airbnb or even Deliveroo or Uber. If we look into social media, what we have trending now a lot is all of this kind of trend around self-care, and all of that is almost exclusively related to be in off-screen. So bathing industry is being very popular because you really shouldn't bring your electrical device with you to the bath. Same with things like people going back to analog with trends around doodling and bullet journaling. And this is very interesting because if you think about it, we used to associate the ability to have access to technology with privilege, but right now we're coming to a point where we just wish we could afford to be off-screen. So if you look at US now, affluent parents are paying more just to send their children to private schools that are advertised as being tech-free, and there's a rising number of tech recovery programs where people pay large sums of money just to be locked in a house away from technology.
So the second trend is actually about where trends are originating from now, and this has shifted quite massively in the last few years. And it's because the world is now much more global, and it's actually finally starting to be kind of one community in terms of trends. So if we look at where these start coming from, we can look to areas such as beauty and fashion for the first indicators of the new trends. So we've seen things like the rise of Korean beauty, so actually in terms of product development, they're about 10 years ahead of the UK in terms of scientific research. And we've also seen things like modest fashion. So what started off as a niche movement actually bubbling up and affecting catwalk fashion and mainstream fashion across the world. In terms of technology, we've got systems that we always aim for, of these like frictionless, seamless experiences. And actually in China, that's kind of already happening, and we're playing catch up in terms of tech. And China's actually set a mission in terms of like a government level piece that in 2025, they'll be the leaders in AI. So we see this continuing, and actually China being a really good source of inspiration for the tech that we develop day to day. We've also seen a shift in terms of business decision making. So we've had movements from workers, things like the Google walkout actually over sexual harassment claims and how they've been dealt with. And businesses are actually changing the way that they not only react to employees, but who they will or will not do business with, from the power of actually the people that are employing them. And we see this trend continuing and actually kind of rippling down to smaller companies. At the moment, it's only in the big ones. But we think actually the social norms of what is acceptable in business are going to change enough that actually even in really small companies, the employees kind of bringing their whole selves to work, and actually you need to then deal with their politics and their ethics if you're going to ask people to be real in terms of workplaces. So really the power's now shifted from the boardroom to the water cooler, and it's all about actually the power in numbers of people. And lastly, the shift of influence that's happened in news. So this is an example kind of from teens. So we've got a lot of fake news going on at the moment. We won't go over all the scandals that have happened. But in terms of where teens are actually going for their information, it's shifted quite a lot. So we've got things like the flop accounts on Instagram and also thread accounts. So flop accounts are where people are getting their news from now. And then thread accounts is kind of where you're looking to like how to live. And it's really shifted and become much more, you trust people who are like you, which has always happened. But those people are now more likely to be halfway across the world than they are to be your neighbor next door. And we see this as a huge shift in terms of where those trends have originated. So it's about people like me, but those people can be globally distributed.
And no wonder that teenagers are looking for different sources of news nowadays. If you open any mainstream newspaper on any given day, the world seems like a pretty gloomy place. So us as consumers, we are starting to wonder that when institutions are failing us, will brands step in to save us all? And if we look to what is happening, why is this being a thing, the big societal and environmental issues that we're facing right now are actually too complex, they're too globally intertwined for one local government to solve. And the same goes for our expectations. So we came to a point where the expectations that us as consumers or citizens have from public and social services are the same as we have from consumer-facing services. That means that I expect the experience of filling in my tax form to be just as good as picking a movie at Netflix. And obviously for institutions, they can't keep up with this, which opens up opportunities for corporations and brands to step in.
The first area that we've seen this happening in is mobility. So City Map is a really good example of where actually a public-private partnership can come into play. So they have these taxi bus hybrid systems now that are running on real-time data to real-time demand, and actually the routes are kind of customized by what people are needing to do. We've also seen it in terms of healthcare. So GP at Hand is a really good example of where actually telemedicine is becoming very widespread, and people are willing to accept that because the service is so much better than what we're getting from just a government service on its own. And the last example here is hers. So this is, you can actually order birth control or prescription skincare just online. And it's much more like a luxury shopping experience than it is dealing with a chemist or a pharmacist and having to divulge all your personal details to get hold of that prescription that you really want. And lastly, we see the opportunity when the government has kind of made space or not stepped up, startups are actually there. So Fast Company's got an issue that's out recently where they're talking about the startups who are kind of forming a resistance against the cuts from the Trump administration. So there are startups working on safe access to abortion clinics, and also startups helping people make their way through the immigration system because it's so complex, the bureaucratic nightmare that they've caused.
This also brings up a question of responsibility. So companies that are interested to step into this place also need to realize what happens when things kind of go wrong. This is an example of Bird, who is the shared electrical scooters services that now functions across the cities in the US and Europe. And what sounded like quite a good idea at the beginning, even though it looks rather weird, kind of backlash with quite a lot of urban clutter to the point where now San Francisco local government is suing them. In France, they're actually taking legislation against the use of these scooters due to the high level of injuries, and so on and so on. So it comes to a point where, yes, this represents a really good opportunity for brands, but they also need to realize that if they want to step into this place, they will be held accountable to say where the government would be, and they need to be aware of this. Otherwise, there is backlash both from citizens as well as the government.
So this one's probably our favorite trend. It brings into question who we are as humans, how we relate to each other, and actually what we value. And it's called AI by myself. And tech gets blamed a lot for loneliness and epidemics that we're seeing in society of people being miserable. But finally, AI can actually be the solution to that as well. So this is Shudu, the world's first digital supermodel. She's being booked for commissions all over the world. And what started off in this fashion sphere is actually moving in terms of our friendships and who we see as companions. So these are all robot friends. So this is happening at the moment. So we've got Paro, which is the cuddly seal you can see there, which is to actually help people with dementia and loneliness. Also there's Zoe, which you can call or you can text, and she's there for you as a friend. And then finally there's Love Plus. So Love Plus has been going on in Japan since 2014. So there it's not so new. But it's actually so normal that you can take your Love Plus, which is like a little DS, out with you on a date and no one thinks it's weird. So these robots or like AIs are actually there for people in ways that maybe friends or family members can't be. And Replica is a really interesting service that's getting a lot of attention lately, and it's basically becoming your digital twin. So you chat to it enough, it learns your patterns of speech, it learns how you kind of behave, and it's there for you almost like a therapist. And what's interesting about that is that AI is actually making moves towards being a much better therapist or friend or companion than it is to being there to like just book you a taxi or book some flowers to be delivered for you. It's actually much more powerful in those relationships that we would almost pay to have than the ones that we wouldn't. And finally, we couldn't not mention sex robots. So this is Harmony. Again, she's getting a lot of press lately. And they're touting it as, again, a solution to the loneliness epidemic. So you too could be the first to never be lonely again. And they've got a chatbot version if you can't afford the full model. So what seems unthinkable now and maybe comes into question of what is humanity, what is a relationship, what actually is even love. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have paid to stay in a stranger's apartment, and now you do it all the time. So we think that AI is actually going to be there, be your friend, be your lover, and be your pet pretty soon.
And staying on the topic, the last trend that we're going to talk about today is that sustainability got sexy and seems like everybody's doing it. So I think that for a while we've all been aware that our behavior as consumers wasn't really that good for the world, but it all seemed kind of too complex, and it felt like the behavior of one individual, there wasn't much that we could do as individuals. But this year what happened was that it moved from this feeling of like no one really cares to all of a sudden everyone is concerned. Sustainability went mainstream, and the mainstream brands need to catch up. So we cannot talk about sustainability without mentioning veganism. And what's interesting here is the rise. So in 2016, there was around 500,000 vegans in the UK. In just 2 years, it's 3.5 million. So what happened that they grew from just a niche group of activists to like a pretty powerful consumer group that is now affecting the offerings of mainstream brands. So you would have Domino's now producing the vegan Supreme Pizza with a vegan cheese, Ben & Jerry's having the vegan ice cream, and so on. WeWork is taking a very interesting take on this, where they're using veganism to take an ethical stand and actually not allowing their employees to expense meat anymore. Obviously, fashion is a big one that's been blamed a lot this year for their contribution to the climate change and pollution in the world. Especially fast fashion had a pretty bad year, both in terms of kind of public backlash, but also decrease in sales. And if we look, this is pretty well reflected in the fashion community as well. So if we look at the fashion bloggers and YouTubers now, they're moving away from their Primark and ASOS haul, and actually you see more and more of them talking about second-hand shopping and ethical brand hauls as a result of the pressure from their subscribers. What is really interesting is also this rise of a new luxury. So if we look now, who are the aspirational brands that we look to is not the usual names. Instead, you're seeing brands like Reformation or Everlane or the sneakers maker Veja that Meghan Markle here is a big fan. They're actually putting sustainability as a core of their brand and showing this new aspirational lifestyle. There's a lot in the zero waste movement and opportunities that lie here. So obviously, I think we're all aware by now with this all new plastic panic and the ban of plastic straws, and also mainstream retailers such as Morrison now encouraging people to bring their own Tupperware to the shops to decrease the plastic packaging of their produce. We can also see it with the adoption of the period caps to reduce the amount of tampons and cotton pads we throw away, and also using tech to kind of mitigate the waste movement. So there will be things like Too Good To Go, which is an app that helps retailers to get rid of the produce at the end of the day rather than going to waste. So as we see, sustainability is no longer just a nice to have. It went mainstream, and now is the time for mainstream brands to catch up and make it accessible. As consumers, we don't want to stop consuming. However, we're looking for brands that will help us to make it easy and convenient to make a choice to consume in a way that makes us feel better and less guilty about our consumption choices.
So that was a whistle-stop tour of those 5 trends for 2020. They're all driven by that underlying meta trend of actually the shift to getting rid of the psychological damaging problems that we've had from digital, and people wanting to actually kind of get back into nature. So now for brands to win, it needs to be less of the instant distraction, instant gratification, and much more about products and services that mean that actually you're building a sustainable relationship with someone into the future, and they look for that as very key.
So as consumers, we will stay loyal to brands that will provide us with anchors, will allow us to buy a sense of belonging, and make it easy for us to live according to value as easily as just asking Alexa to get me my period cup.
And the biggest shift is actually, so we've gone from a world where brands measured consumers in terms of their lifetime value.
And actually now we move to consumer measuring the long-term and lifetime value of brands on both their life as well as the planet that we live in. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Hello. I'm interested a bit in talking about when you started the conversation with design thinking becoming more future thinking. Can you elaborate a bit more about what sort of techniques you're using in this kind of thinkings, and how can brands use it and adopt it within their organizations and companies?
So the similarity there is that they both use a system of converging and diverging. And in a way, if you look at what's happening with design thinking, you kind of go to the world to understand what's the behavior of people, kind of collect your information, and then use and synthesize those to arrive to one idea. What we do with future thinking is a little bit different. So you actually come to the world, look at what's happening, synthesize it, and then use it again as a departing point for scenarios. So what you're trying to do at the end is diverge again. So rather than converging into one idea, it's the other way around when you open up and understand, okay, these are all of these different possibilities, all different futures where this could go. So if you're working as a brand and using this process, then you can understand, okay, based on what this is happening, these are the three versions, what could go. How can this inform our strategy in the present? If we know this is how the future could go, what can we do now to be ready for all of these three outcomes?
And there's a technique called the futures cone, which is really good for doing that. So it basically looks at 4 Ps. So I think it's possible, plausible, preferable, and probable futures. And it basically takes this point that we are in time now, and you imagine that something has become so mainstream that it's been adopted to the kind of most extreme version of itself. And from there, you sort of start to scenario plan and build the worlds from it. We also use the futures wheel quite a lot. So you kind of start out with a trend in the middle, and then you start saying, if this is true, what's like the best and worst things that can possibly happen from it to society, to a business, and then you just kind of work outwards and keep combining those different scenarios you've made until you end up in like utopias and dystopias, which are pretty fun. All right, thank you.